I'm humbled by Ron Horvath's mission, and my prayer is that something is inspired in your mind and your heart to further his mission in your life. I'd like to begin by acknowledging three people who were studying the brain in the light of the heavenly doctrines of the New Jerusalem in the 1970s in Denver, Colorado. The first is my late brother, Martin Echols, who encouraged me to be curious about the brain and whose insights about the formation of the brain I hope can one day enrich scientists' views of the brain. Second, I would like to acknowledge the late Reverend Kurt Nemitz, who directed Martin towards important teachings in the heavenly doctrines. And third, I would like to acknowledge Fernando Caracena, an actual scientist, who supported Kurt and Martin in their shared interest in the study of the brain. I believe you will hear more about Fernando later. I also need to make a disclaimer. I am not a scientist. Remember that. However, understanding the gross anatomy and functions of the parts of the brain has been a significant part of my training as a mental health counselor. I have also studied the brain, what I'd like to say is in vivo. That is, I have sat with hundreds of people and watched how their brains worked. And this was enlightening because I was practicing the integration of spirituality and psychotherapy through it all. So I would like you all to take away this message. Be curious. Cultivate curiosity. I can confidently report to you that your curiosity will prepare you to discover spiritual truths and respond affirmatively to them. Also, I'd like to say that by sacred, I mean spiritual as distinct from profane, the merely worldly, the merely physical or natural. I want to assert that the merely profane cannot account for the observations we can all make about the capabilities of the human being and the human brain. I am convinced that divine endeavor is received by the brain, creating mental and emotional actualities that we all experience. This is the sacred in the brain. A secondary goal is for you to be free to think deeply, widely, and affirmatively rather than negatively. I encourage you to have an affirmative doubt, which will encourage you to learn more. Thus, I hope this presentation is emancipatory and releases you from any fear you may have of being right or wrong or of not existing. I'm advocating a worldview and a way of being that produces the experience of joy and satisfaction in your life. So now I'd like to present to you a number of examples that make my case. These come from a variety of studies and from the heavenly doctrines. When I observe that I value someone and seek the origin of their value, I discover their humanity, which is a reality that is within or above, logically, psychologically, and physiologically, all the person's traits that we see, all the appearances, all their culture. Such external measures are actually there, but they cannot determine a person's worth. My human curiosity has led me to understand the reality which allows, indeed encourages me to conjoin with other people in a mutual effort to experience joy and satisfaction. I am wired to seek that attachment by the Lord, and that's the way I connect with their worth and discover its origin. I'm curious about the origin of the capabilities of Homo sapiens. Archaeological remains give us certain information, and the theory of evolution is thought by many to satisfy our need to know who we are and where we came from. However, it's generally accepted that the merely materialistic explanation of natural selection does not provide a satisfying understanding of many of the human capabilities we all have. For instance, natural selection does not account for my anticipating my own death, which we all do. Cave drawings and burial plots from 70,000 years ago show evidence of humans having a consciousness of their own death and a belief that they survive their death. Such a reality cannot be developed by a merely natural selection of traits. And during the last mere 200 years, we have observed enough human behavior that we can describe the stages of development of a death consciousness. I observe and I am curious about my own awareness of my death. I further wonder, why am I disturbed by an awareness of my death? Being disturbed by my awareness of death is evidence of the sacred in the brain. My anxiety about my death is resolved by positing that the human brain responds to an endeavor to live forever, which of course the brain cannot do. This endeavor is a non-physical reality, a spiritual energy, an inflow from the divine, the source, life, whatever is your term. That is a satisfying explanation of my experience of life, for it mitigates my anxiety about my death. It's very real. And I know it does this because it allows me, this endeavor to live forever, allows me to continue to experience joy and satisfaction here and now. And now here are two examples of the effort to understand human consciousness. Some materialists want to acknowledge human consciousness by ascribing it to the passive role of mental experience measurable in brain activity. The images from functional MRIs give us an adequate information to assign correlative relationships between brain function and some basic emotions. However, it is also observable that there is mental activity independent of any specific brain state, or for which no brain state has yet been found. For instance, the preference of one flavor of ice cream over another. I prefer chocolate. I don't understand why anyone doesn't prefer chocolate ice cream over all the other flavors. Now, we can correlate a specific brain state observed by means of a functional MRI in that thought, that state of mind, but we cannot tell from that image which flavor I prefer. Evidence of the sacred in the brain. The second example is there are materialist explorations of consciousness which seek to understand one's sense of self. It has been observed that there is a strong sense of self, or me-ness, associated with our bodies. We can attribute to the brain a large number of deficits to human behavior and cognition and emotions due to brain injury and brain deficits. The loss of a sense that I am my body, or having a sense that a part of my body is not me, is, as you can imagine, very disturbing. It's caused by some brain problem. However, what researchers have demonstrated clearly is only that the worldly or bodily me-ness is subjectively described and correlated with specific brain functions or brain malfunctioning due to energy injury or drug-induced brain states, for instance. As profound as that sense of self is, it is merely physical or physiological. Its explanations are dependent on brain function alone and does not consider the singularly mental sense of self, which we all can experience, that does not depend on our body. Even observable psychological ramifications are not explained by mere brain function. I have found that the heavenly doctrine's explanation of the mind-brain interdependence by means of discrete degrees that correspond is satisfying explanation for consciousness. I cannot do justice to what theistic science has to offer to the exploration of human consciousness here, and I encourage you to continue to explore it with curiosity. I am curious about feeling responsible. I have learned that it is not satisfying to blame the table leg for the pain I feel when I hit my toe against it. I own that physical pain. It's my experience of my responsibility. It's mine. So that's an example of experiencing responsibility on a physical degree of life. Also, I have learned that it is not satisfying to blame other people for my lack of happiness when they don't give it to me. Right? I own my unhappiness as my experience of perhaps an emotional wound that interferes with my happiness. And I have learned that it does not satisfy my drive to understand my feeling of responsibility to blame someone else for the emotional pain they experience when I diminish their value or dismiss their joy. I am not responsible for supplying their happiness, but I am responsible for my projection of my fear that harms the relationship I have with that other person, which is the pain they feel. My experience of responsibility, physically, psychologically, and spiritually, is evidence for the sacred in the brain, because no neural pathway, no excitation of an area of the brain can account for me feeling responsible. Whereas a sense of ownership can be the product of the divine endeavor to give me individual life through discrete degrees related by correspondence. Many experiments have shown how the brain assesses if there is any threat to its continued existence or its ability to reproduce itself. The human brain has evolved to do this assessment continuously and with as little energy as possible. This ability is not particularly or peculiarly human, but materialists maintain that it accounts for a multitude of psychological and physiological drives, including procreation, a favored family structure, elements of culture, that can also be seen in non-human species. So materialists have a view of how this works. I suggest that the human capacity to assess danger can be seen to have a far deeper and fundamental purpose compared to other species. I observe human beings optimizing the possibility of developing, maintaining, and protecting conjunction with other humans beyond what even the most advanced animals can do. The normal, continuous assessment of our surroundings, clearly seen in the activation of the amygdala and the brainstem, is used by humans not merely to protect themselves and their tribe. Humans also demonstrate a non-measurable need for mutual love among human beings to achieve their goal of the reduction of threat. And so after years of successfully connecting with fellow human beings, we come ultimately to trust in God for real safety. More evidence of the sacred in the brain. I'm curious how dead matter is enlivened to produce living organisms. My curiosity has led me to observe that it happens by the inflow of the living endeavor of God's life. The notion of correspondence explains how this giving of life happens. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. It is a very satisfying exploration. One short example of this non-materialist and non-dualist thinking is found in the work Divine Love and Wisdom, number 218. Quote, "People know that endeavor accomplishes nothing by itself, but only through forces corresponding to it, and that through forces, endeavor produces motion. People also know that for that reason, endeavor is everything that is the essence, the lifeblood, the meaning in the forces. And through the forces, endeavor is everything in the motion. And that because motion is the final degree of endeavor. It is through motion that endeavor exerts its power." Modern physics, quantum mechanics, I am told, because I'm not that scientist, is beginning to prove this rational explanation. But I'm sure the exploration of the origin of life will continue indefinitely, and you are welcome to continue that. We want the human mind to be real, which means that it must consist of some substance. Materialists choose physical substance because they want to be able to see the mind and to touch it, to be assured that it actually exists. Anything less leaves them worried about the reality of their own consciousness because they have no idea where it's coming from. They don't know how to manage it, how to handle it. They don't know what's going to happen to it. Do you feel the anxiety rising? Because the materialists cannot find the mind in the brain, they are left wondering if their life is an illusion generated by the matrix. Now, Swedenborg is one of hundreds of committed anatomists over the years who have not found the mind anywhere in the body. Now, like the materialists, I observe that not knowing how it is that I am who I am makes me existentially nervous. Indeed, I notice a deeply seated fear of not knowing who I am if I cannot find evidence for the reality of my mind. It's common to us all. Now, the materialist resolves this anxiety by more or less convincingly positing consciousness in brain processes. In effect, the materialist's need to find the mind is driven by a fear that, being ignorant, they will also lose any purpose or meaning for their lives. And then my curiosity is piqued. I'm noticing that perhaps my curiosity is somehow, some way, allowing me to bypass the materialist's fear. Now, notice a couple of things happening here. Positing a human mind consisting of non-material substance denies the materialist's point of view and so triggers their anxiety. They need to react to that assertion. I've observed this happening in dozens of people who are my clients. Many cognitive behavioral therapies have been developed to address the anguish of meaninglessness. And many of my clients experience resolution to this fear, as I do, by continuing to affirm everywhere I find it demonstrations of the sacred in the brain. That is, the non-material or spiritual endeavor that produces the experience of joy and satisfaction in this life, here and now, despite the lack of evidence in the material world for the mind. I am curious about how my mind moves my body but cannot move a billiard ball. Although, I report this in all seriousness, the Monroe Institute, perhaps you've heard of it, offers a course to learn how to do it. I've not checked it out, full disclosure, but I am curious. I'm not sure I'll pay for the course, but I do want to look it up. It's really there. Don't laugh. These people are serious. And I'm not making fun of them. I think it's a noble effort, and it'd be interesting to see how they pull it off. It is well understood that as I engage my brain, my nerves, my muscles, I can develop muscle memory, right? And I become better and better at hitting a billiard ball such that it goes into any pocket I choose. It's amazing what the body can learn to do almost completely on its own because the brain and the muscles have learned it. And it is also commonly experienced by grandfathers such as I that I am not limited to the dictates of muscle memory because I can purposefully choose to miss the shot in order to give my grandchild a chance at childish joy. It is the sacred in the brain that would choose the less optimal outcome for the sake of a higher purpose. The materialist and the spiritual person fear non-existence pretty equally. I observe that the materialist worldview leads to an unresolvable despair. I've been curious about my fear of non-existence. I've helped clients navigate their fear. We have learned that the fear does not go away. I was once a student of existential philosophy, which has been popularly considered a materialist view. It need not be. The belief that existence precedes essence, that existence precedes meaning-making or purpose, that use precedes form, is in fact a conclusion we can all make because the sacred, the creator, the source, the divine, precedes my conscious decisions that create my meaning and my purpose of my life. By living as though spiritual life precedes natural life and does not depend upon it for existence, the fear of non-existence loses its power. It dissipates. The spiritual worldview of the prior existence of the sacred does not remove the responsibility I have to choose my purpose and meaning, which is at the heart of existential philosophy. As the existential philosopher would point out, under no circumstances can I abdicate owning my purpose and meaning. The sacred in the brain is an elegant explanation for the quality of the results of my choices of purpose and meaning, good and bad. This is why the ever-present fear of non-existence has no power to destroy joy, satisfaction, and the peace that I experience right here and right now. My experience of guilt for doing or not doing something is a mental experience. One materialist view posits that all actions are inevitable. I'm curious how, when I choose an action, I can experience guilt. How would that happen if my action was inevitable? We can predict what the brain is going to do in response to specific stimuli. We can say with assurance that a certain response is inevitable. And we can change physiological conditions for a person by altering their brain, for instance, to stop otherwise inevitable seizures. Yet there is no correlation between a person's experience of guilt and any brain function. This is evidence of the sacred in the brain. I am curious about the freedom I experience. I experience a freedom that is not merely the absence of constraint. And I experience the essence of freedom that is not that which a majority of voters can take away. Freedom is, in its essence, equilibrium. Equilibrium in the brain results in the ability to choose and the ability to change one's mind. We can observe equilibrium in the brain in the functional MRI. We can measure the equilibrium by assessing the optimal operation and outcome of certain brain activities. The conclusion is that the freedom to choose is, in fact, not dependent on any one particular brain state. Now, certainly, we can impact our experience of freedom by altering the brain, for instance, with alcohol. Alcohol can so upset the brain's equilibrium that the choices I make can be harmful to myself and to others, in direct opposition to millions of years of evolution of my self-preservation instincts. The brain will seek that equilibrium, and our fundamental freedom will persist because of the sacred in the brain, which is the divine endeavor to seek and maintain equilibrium. It is well documented that the brain has processes that take over involuntarily to protect itself. The impulse to fight, flee, or freeze is an example. There's 2 points to make here. The first is that with practice, humans, not other species, can ignore or override this involuntary response. Non-humans cannot. The second point is that the mechanism of automatic protective response cannot account for the equally obvious reality of human ethics and morality. The drive for self-preservation by itself is inadequate to explain the equally fundamental drive for connection between human beings. It is quintessentially human to abandon self-preservation for loving and protecting another human being. And while indeed there is an enormous propensity to violence in our drive to survive, the vast majority of humans use that energy to be creative and to produce harmony with other humans. Now, returning to the observation that the brain can learn to anticipate what is about to happen, in fact, it has been discovered that the heart has a neural network and reacts before the brain does to a certain number of stimuli. Pretty incredible that your heart can react before your brain does. One example of this, perhaps, have you noticed that as you are speaking and not reading something you've prepared, an idea of what to say forms in your mind before you select the words to express it? An idea comes to your mind before you have the words to express it. I invite you to check that out in your next conversation. It takes some practice, but anyone can notice this happening in their mind. No mechanism in the brain can account for this common human ability. This physiology serves to allow for the sacred in the brain to respond to the spiritual endeavor that is already present before we become conscious of an impulse. Consider this observation. To rely on a mechanistic explanation or on merely physical attributes to understand human individual uniqueness both diminishes our uniqueness and devalues our humanity. Rather, positing the existence of an indefinite number of unique spiritual individuals is cognitively and emotionally satisfying notion. And, again, I'm told because I don't understand it myself, quantum physics is confirming this principle of indefinite and continual creation of individual minds. The existence of an indefinite number of unique individuals is an issue that the brain has learned to manage. The brain has automatic processes that discriminate among the things it encounters. For instance, we learn how hot something can be and not be dangerous. There seems to be universal reactions to specific circumstances, like the hiss of a snake or a smile. Our brain is wired to make these important distinctions automatically. Now, here's the application to our proposal of the sacred in the brain. Everyone here has first or perhaps second-hand experience of a human being whose cognitive and or emotive processing style is so different from the norm that the person has been labeled. We have created scales to help us discriminate among people so that we may effectively interact with them and care for them. Perhaps the widest scale we could devise would have genius at one end and comatose at the other. Right? Psychology has devised a spectrum, and there are assessments to determine an individual's place on the spectrum. Now, it's certainly true that the brain's manner of functioning makes a contribution to where we each find ourselves on the scale or on the spectrum. The brain has a role in that. And yet, humans very regularly ignore the brain's system of discrimination in order to actively connect with people across the entire scale. We make no distinction. The mechanism of the brain cannot account for our ignoring its automatic learned function of discrimination. I believe that's evidence for the sacred in the brain. I am curious about the results of clinical trials of the psychotropic drugs psilocybin, lysergic acid diethylamide, and ayahuasca. Look them up. These medicines impact brain functions such that conscious, cognitive, and affective processes formed through the experiences of our life and disrupted by trauma, for instance, no longer interfere with optimal brain function. That the usual pathways that supply us with a sense of satisfaction and normalcy that had been hijacked by trauma or by habitual behaviors and by mind-altering substances all are put aside somehow. These medicines break a person's dependence on these well-established neural pathways, and patients report relief from the negative impact of trauma, and they report the resolution of their mood disorders and even serious mental disorders such as schizophrenia. This is wonderful news. We need to take advantage of it. And I assure you that a lot of work is being done to discover the uses of these medicines. However, what is germane to us today is that those patients regularly report having what the researchers are calling mystical experiences. It is so much a part of the treatment to have these experiences that there are specific conversations between the patient and the clinician before the medicine is given to prepare them for the mystical experience. Now, while a mood disorder may not be permanently resolved by a course of treatment, the patient regularly reports a new, positively impactful experience of their spirituality. Many researchers are convinced that these results describe a real spirituality which is not dependent upon or arising from brain function. Theistic science arising out of the heavenly doctrines of the new church can certainly help describe what is happening. Of the large number of observations by Emanuel Swedenborg, and I need the quote up now, that encourage me to see the human being as a spiritual being clothed in a body, and which make me curious about the world around me, I choose to share this one to conclude my presentation. Do I do that? DLW 53. I have to use the mouse. I'd like you to read this along with me, that's all. Yeah, that's it, 53. DLW 53. No, yeah. It's up there? Created, finite things may be said to have reality and manifestation, substance and form, life, and even love and wisdom. But all of these are created and finite. The reason we can say they have these attributes is not that they possess any divinity, but that they are in divinity and there is divinity in them. Anything that has been created is intrinsically without soul and dead, but it is given a soul and brought to life by the presence of divinity in it and by its dwelling in divinity. So be curious and discover how this is true for you in your life. Thank you.